Under Pressure is the classic song by David Bowie in collaboration with Queen, all about the pressures that we face, our common experience as human beings, and how difficult that is from day to day. Experts, of course, are human beings. They feel pressure and stress as well. And of course, also, they make mistakes when they're under pressure. That's not as interesting because it's kind of obvious. More interesting is that the things that come out, the problems that happen when experts are under pressure, reveal deficiencies in systems that involve human experts. And so looking at that and seeing what happens in those kinds of cases are kind of revealing. It can help us to understand how to be more reliable, how to be more resilient when we're under pressure if we're experts. So today I'm going to talk to you about a very particular case, the Madrid bombing case that occurred in 2004. It's associated with a latent print impression error. And it was an outgrowth, actually, unusually enough, of this, which is the Iraq War, which started on March 20th, 2003. And our story, at least as far as I'm going to cover it, ends here with the publication of a report from the Department of Justice Office of Inspector General, which detailed a lot of what happened with respect to the internal doings in the Department of Justice and the FBI related to the latent fingerprint that was recovered from a bomb scene. Again, that was an outgrowth of the Iraq War. Now, a lot of people don't remember this, but back in 2003, the government of Spain was one of the most ardent supporters of the war in Iraq. A lot of people remember the United States and Bush and the United Kingdom and Tony Blair, but actually the Spanish government was right there in terms of saying there should be a coalition to go into Iraq and deal with Saddam Hussein, weapons of mass destruction, all of that. Unfortunately for the Spanish government, they were not nearly in the same position as the United States and the United Kingdom with respect to popular support for the war. Even before the invasion and then continuing through the next year, the opposition party, but also many ordinary Spanish citizens, just didn't support Spanish involvement in terms of boots on the ground in Iraq. Now, this was known by some of the people who opposed the coalition, including, of course, Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda saw the invasion of Iraq as a test case for the American military, and a way for them to split the coalition was something that they were looking for from the get-go. And Spain seemed to be one of the most important weak parts. And as a result, they planned a terrorist attack against the Spanish. And this is what happened on March 11th, 2004. There were a series of bomb attacks against the commuter trains in and around the city of Madrid in Spain. And so almost about a year to the day almost from the date of the invasion of Iraq. The Spanish government itself made a big tactical mistake at this point. They claimed that this was the operation of Basque separatists. Basques have wanted to be independent of Spain for centuries, really, and they have had a separatist movement in Spain, but this is a scale of attack that the Basque had not conducted anything like it in many, many years. And everyone just believed from the outgo that was incorrect. And they were just trying to cover the fact that this was an outgrowth of the Iraq situation. Nonetheless, the Spanish National Police did do a very, very good job pulling together information from around the scenes where the bomb attacks had occurred over the next several days, including some unexploded ordnance. There was unexploded bombs, say in backpacks, that kind of thing, associated with obviously the train attacks, but bombs that weren't successful in terms of actually delivering the explosions. And on one particular backpack that had an IED in it, they recovered this, which is LFP-17, and that's what we're going to refer to it as from here forward. LFP-17 was recovered from actually, I believe it was a piece of plastic at the scene. This is normal distortion for a latent print. It may seem a little bit smudgy, not very high quality, but actually this isn't too bad in terms of the quality of the image. That becomes important here, as I'll explain in a minute, in terms of, kind of the sequence of events as it unfolded. They didn't have a match right off the bat to that latent print. And so they did what was routine for them, which was to load it into Interpol, where it went around to governments around the world, including to the United States, including in that case to the FBI laboratory. So LFP 17, then this image then went over to the FBI laboratory. Now, as I said, the image was not a bad image, but it did lack certain kinds of things that it really should have had. And this is where our first lesson comes in. So first, it lacked scale for proper enlarging. So you can imagine you see this and you're like, well, what was the, how big is this finger or thumb or whatever it is? What, you need to have a scale, and ideally a two-dimensional scale that would allow you to properly orient and understand the size of the print, for analysis. It also lacked what is called a context shot. That is, where was this print collected from? Where on the backpack, or as I said, this piece of plastic or whatever it was. And that allows you to orient the print, because very seldom does somebody give you a nice simple little, I'm going to put my nice fingerprint on there for you. It could be off to the side. It could be a side of the finger. You do see what is called the delta here, which actually does help to orient the print to some extent. But on the other hand, you do, just standard operating procedure, you should have a context shot to allow you to understand that and to do a more reliable job on the latent print examination. The other thing is that there were some complaints about whether the digital image quality in terms of how it was transmitted was good enough. In fact, it was. I believe the standard at this time was 500 dots per inch. It matched or met at least FBI guidelines for digital image quality. And therefore, this really is an interesting type of human failure. And I will tell you, as somebody who has talked an awful lot with state and local law enforcement who have worked with the FBI, that what they would say at this stage is, what if I did this, if I, as a state and local police officer or department, sent this up to the FBI and it had these things missing, the FBI would give me a call and say, not good enough. They would say, what is this stuff you're sending me? This, it doesn't have, all of the information I need to be able to do a reliable comparison. Will call us back when you have your ducks in a row, when you've gotten your act together. That is not what the FBI did in this case. And you can imagine, think about it from their perspective at this point. This was a very sensitive time when the invasion was going okay, I suppose. The insurgency was starting to ramp up in Iraq. There was 2004 was an election year for Bush. There, I'm sure, were a lot of stresses and pressures, as we talk about, on the FBI lab to get things done. And so they almost certainly looked on this print from Spain very differently than they would have looked on a print that came in from the state and local law enforcement. So all of these issues with image quality didn't come back to saying, well, we need to communicate back to the Spanish National Police, the SNP, that LFP 17, we need more information on this print. And so there was a human failure here on the basis of not that the fact that the image was not good enough, but there wasn't communication about whatever concerns they had about the image quality. And that is really a key here. Being under pressure doesn't mean that you stop communicating. And it is kind of, you can see how that would occur. It's not unheard of when we feel stressed and we can kind of fall within ourselves and not be willing to go back out and take the time to get all the right information and to communicate. We rush under stress. We say, well, this has got to be done. Your boss puts something on your desk and says, I need this by 5. It's very hard to go back to your boss and say, in order to do this properly, as I've been trained to do, or whatever it is, I need to have an extra 2 hours, or I need to have until tomorrow, or whatever it is. It's very common for us not to give that pushback. And it really isn't pushback. It's about properly communicating what you need to do as an expert. And so you really shouldn't even look at it back. You should be looking at, well, what do I need to do to be reliable to if this is so important, it's certainly important enough to do right, So in that case, you have certain standards in your work. The FBI has certain standards in what they do in latent print analysis. In both cases, the standards need to be maintained. This actually is a screenshot of the latent print workstation running the IAFIS database. So IAFIS is the International Automated Fingerprint Identification System, and IAFIS today has 162 million profiles. Back in 2004, it was less than that, but it was still quite a large database. And this is a problem in the sense that first, it gave the examiners the impression that, well, this is a bad guy who left this print. We're going to find this bad guy by going into IAFIS. We have so many people in IAFIS. We'll find. And the other problem, though, is more subtle and more generic. That goes way beyond latent prints, and that is, the database had gotten so big that they were very likely to get what is called a close non-match. And think about it this way: if you do a Google search, you say, you would Google the Madrid bombing, for example. It's very possible that the first few hits that you'll get from Google may not be the right hits. They may relate to some other kind of incident other than the 2004 train bomb. And you need to be able to go through those and see which one is actually relevant to you, because Google has so much information. The same is true for IAFIS. It's got so many prints in it that your chances that the first thing on the hit list is going to be the thing you want is very, very, not very, very unlikely, but it certainly is a challenge. It's not always like that. When you see on TV, it's like, they do this fingerprint databases and it goes click, 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 and, up comes, Thanos or whatever it is on the list, and you get Thanos's picture. It's not like that. Generally speaking, you need to go through 10 to 20 of the candidates in the list to be able to say, well, which one truly is a match and which ones can I look at and see they really, really don't match. The other thing that was happening here at this point is that they really didn't have a lot that they had extracted from the latent print. They only had 7 points of comparison that they felt really strongly could be put into IAFIS to do this database search. And generally speaking, you want to do more than that. 12 to 15 is really ideal. And so that also meant that they were getting a lot of extra hits that they might not have gotten otherwise. So as you can see, they did get LFP 17. They did get number 4 on the hit list, an individual at the index finger of an individual that seemed to them to be a pretty good match. And so we have LFP 17, and we have IAFIS potential source number 4 on that hit list that came back. And then they went forward to say, well, is this a match? And the problem is that even though I'm sure these were very well trained examiners and I'm sure they didn't put the first person out of college onto the Madrid bombing print, nonetheless, you really don't know. Even today, the testing that occurs for fingerprint examiners doesn't determine how good they are at close non-matches. In order to do that, they would need to be tested to failure. So, if you want to know how strong a steel beam is, you don't just, pull it with, some small force and say, oh, well, that's okay. What you need to do is you need to test it until you break it. That tells you how strong that steel beam is. If you want to know how strong an examiner is, you test them to break it. And that's not what happens in certification testing for latent print examiners. And as a result, how good are they at really doing the task that was before them in that March of 2004? This is one of the recommendations that came out of a quality assurance review later that year, and said verifiers should be given challenging exclusions during blind proficiency tests. And I would say the testing is better now than it was, but they are definitely not tested to failure, which is how I would like to see. So one of the other things that happened is they did what's called teasing the point. So you can see here, if you look at this print, you can kind of convince yourself of seeing what is called level 3 detail. So if you look along the lines here, you'll see little dots and that kind of thing. Those are probably sweat pores. And so if you have a really, really good, and these days with some of the electronic collection, you can get this really, really nicely. You can see the sweat pores along the ridges and valleys of the finger that or what is called level 3 detail. The problem with level 3 detail is, yeah, you can pick it up in an ideal situation, such as when the fingerprint is being collected, but crime scenes aren't ideal situations. And so do you know whether you're picking up real level 3 detail, or do you know that you're picking up, or that you're just seeing distortions or convincing yourself of something in terms of the features that you see? And so what happened then, let's see if I can get it. So if you look at, so this is number 4, this is LFP 17, and you can actually, I'll put my head out of the way here, and so you can pause the video if you like, and you can see, like, there's this island here, and there's a similar feature in over here in the latent print. Here's the delta, and you can see like this little island here, and you can convince yourself there's something like that, the kind of structure. This isn't a simple comparison. So this isn't where it's obvious that, they are a non-match here, that these two don't match. There are features that appear to line up between the two of them, and as a result, it's easy to get into the mode where you're convinced that this is a real match. And this was one of the primary lessons. Again, they were under pressure, but they were also in a state where they were looking at what is truly a difficult comparison. This was not a simple matter. They used these level 3 details. Again, they would not have used that level of detail and what is called teasing the points nearly as aggressively in a lower profile case, in my opinion. For a long time, examiners have looked down on the use of level 3 details to do comparisons, and even to this day, you will that will be questioned by colleagues if an examiner uses level 3 details, and justifiably so. It's not like it couldn't be used. They couldn't be used at some level, but it is a problem. Also, there really weren't very good. There wasn't good documentation. I mean, it isn't like they didn't say, well, here's the points we see in LFP 17, and here's the points we see in source number 4, and sort of circle them. But in order for it to be a match, they need to line up, the constellations of those points need to line up exactly correct. And there were inconsistencies between the two, and they really didn't do a good job explaining that. And this is where, in my view, one of the most important problems came in. There are two of them. First, in any kind of latent print impression, there's what is called a verification. So the initial person does what is called analysis, comparison, and evaluation. They come up with this answer, in this case, source number 4. And then the verifier comes in to see whether the verifier agrees with the original conclusion. But in this case, the verifier knew the original conclusion, and as a result, they were clearly biased in this case. So you had this issue where people talk, it's very common to talk about case context, but this kind of context is actually much more common in wrongful convictions. This was never a wrongful conviction, but in wrongful convictions, this is the kind of context that is much more of a problem in pattern evidence examination, where there's a kind of an assumption that the colleague was correct. Now, I don't think that they were just, foolishly or stupidly saying, well, I see inconsistencies, but I'm going to agree with George. I don't believe, especially in a case like this, that they would do that. Nonetheless, there's nobody that perfect that they wouldn't be influenced to some degree by the original conclusion. If the verifier had been completely blind to the original conclusion, if they'd gone right back to, I'm going to plot out the points and do my own IAFIS search, it's very possible they would not have come up with 4 as being the match to LFP 17. And finally, and this is a really big deal, the manager's technical review was rushed and inadequate. Remember how I said they didn't document and explain the inconsistencies well enough? This is where the manager really was supposed to step in. The manager isn't just somebody who doesn't know latent print examination. They're supposed to be somebody who's been doing latent print work and was somebody who'd been doing latent print work for many years. So it isn't like that person was unfamiliar with what the standard was for how to document and explain all of the points of comparison and all of the problems that might have occurred. Why didn't the manager demand even more documentation and a better job in this situation than in another one? Again, I think you're seeing a pattern here, at least I hope you are, in the sense that being under pressure, being under stress, you can be in the FBI lab is arguably the premier forensic laboratory in the world, and still lose your way because of that pressure, because you don't enforce the standards that you should all the time. Perhaps, and this is something that came out in other disciplines in the FBI in the 90s, perhaps they never really established the standards that they should have for a manager's technical review. That's an interesting question, and I don't have a good answer for that. I could argue both sides of that particular question. So anyway, on March 20th, regardless of all of those concerns, the laboratory then reported up to Maine FBI, and that's this concrete monstrosity here in the picture, is the J. Edgar Hoover building, the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. It's a terrible building. The lab actually used to be in a little corner of the building before they moved out to what is called the Battleship in Quantico, Virginia, around this time. And but before this, they really didn't have an idea of who source number 4 was. But when they reported it up, at that point, source number 4 was identified, and it was identified as a person by the name of Brandon Mayfield. And so this is one of the outgrowths of this case that are sometimes misrepresented, because one of the aspects of Mr. Mayfield is that he was a lawyer, but he was also a Muslim lawyer. And he represented people in, I think it was Oregon, in divorce cases, things of that nature. And it was said darkly at this time. I still don't have anything that document what it meant to say that he had loose ties to terrorists. So, like, did he represent somebody in a divorce proceeding whose second cousin was, involved in terrorism somewhere? I don't even know. And I've never seen all those kind of innuendos that were leveled against Mayfield really documented after the fact, at least in terms of what my research has indicated. Now, to be fair, though, the lab didn't know who source number 4 was. So to the extent that there was a kind of anti-Muslim bias in the case, it occurred after Mayfield had been identified in the IAFIS search as source number 4. So the initial identification of Mayfield does not implicate those kinds of issues. After he was identified and all the subsequent things that we're going to talk about, I think you can argue those were influenced, at least to some degree, by his background and identification as a Muslim, and whatever this dark thing about who he was associated with was. So at this point, the FBI then sends LFP-17 and Brandon Mayfield's print and name back over to the Spanish National Police. And so this is in April 2004. At this point, the SNP has the information about this comparison. They are not satisfied with the work of the FBI in this regard. This is exactly what they say. The details don't match. There are too many unexplained dissimilarities. And at this point, this is a big red flag. Right? The FBI, so what is the reaction you would have if you had a work product, somebody comes back and says, no, that does not look right? The first reaction you have is to become defensive. And guess what the FBI did? And, the FBI, of course, they have this issue where they do kind of sometimes feel like they are the FBI, so they're not the ones who make mistakes. It was those pesky Spanish or somebody else who wasn't getting it right. And so instead of saying, well, let's go back and make sure we got this right, instead they put together a PowerPoint. It was a 3-page slide presentation. They said, hey, SNP, let's have a meeting where we can show you, because it appears you aren't getting it, how this match is correct. And so they went into this defensive mode, defending their conclusion, saying, hey, we're right, we're the FBI, and we don't need to do re-examination for you. And the SMP was like, no, thank you. You do you, and we're going to do us. We're going to keep looking to see who the source of LFP-17 is. And so, nonetheless, the FBI then went to federal district court and said, hey, we need to put Mayfield under surveillance. They did this for a time period in late March and early April. And in some of the affidavits that were filed, they started doing this language as I was talking about. So first they said it was a 100% positive identification of Mayfield. And it also talked about his religious practices and association with other Muslims, and this kind of innuendo about whether he was just I don't know, a sleeper agent. I don't even know what the theory would have been. So in April of 2004, the district court then said you can put him under surveillance, and then not long after that, he was identified as a material witness of the terrorist bombing in Madrid and arrested. So this was on May 6th of 2004 is when that arrest occurred. Now, you can imagine this was a big deal. And I just have a smattering of headlines from newspapers.com that I pulled out about this. This is his mom, who was she's like, this is Brandon Mayfield. My son did not do this, which you'd expect. And the rest of his family rallying around him. The most important thing is this over here on the side here, which both Mayfield and his lawyers immediately felt that the fingerprint was questionable, and immediately went on the offensive, saying the FBI lab has made a mistake here. And this was a time when latent print examiners were claiming a 0 error rate. And so this claim, they were very quick to dismiss this claim, saying, this is just another guilty criminal who is, trying to get out from under, this, the power of forensic science. Nonetheless, there was enough light around this idea that the print was wrong, so that the court decided to appoint an independent examiner to look at the print. Now, here, the interesting part here is, as the independent examiner was well aware of the original conclusion of the FBI. That independent examiner wasn't beholden to the FBI or part of the FBI, but the independent examiner was fully aware that Brandon Mayfield was this source number 4, who was the putative match to LFP-17. And the court-appointed examiner on the 19th of May reports back and says, yep, it's Mayfield, all right. He's a match. If nothing else happened at this point, there's a reasonable likelihood Mayfield would have become a wrongfully convicted defendant, because this print that was found on the backpack is such a strong evidence. I mean, he was there. His print is on a bomb that, was part of a terrorist attack that killed, I think it was hundreds of people in Spain. And he would have been tried. And I believe he would have been convicted, even if it was just on the print and the innuendo. Fortunately for him and for the justice system in general, on that same day, on May 19th, the Spanish National Police provided a letter to the FBI that the print had actually been identified, and identified correctly in this case. I believe it was an Algerian national. This man, and I'm going to butcher his name, and I apologize, Onan Daoud is how I'm pronouncing it. So Daoud's print was a match to the backpack to LFP-17, and his finger was the source of LFP-17. Here's all 3 of them together. So on the left over here, this is the latent print. In the middle is Daoud, and here is Mayfield. Again, if you want, you can pause the video and take a look at them more closely. What's interesting, because these are the two clean ones, is to compare Mayfield with Daoud, and they are very closely aligned. You can easily see how one could get fooled, where a latent left by this finger and a latent left by this finger could be confused if there was sufficient distortion. However, there are significant dissimilarities between the two of them, and there are significant dissimilarities between Mayfield and the latent print, and clear hit to Daoud and his finger. So the SMP sends a letter to the FBI saying, hey, it's been identified as Daoud, and Mayfield is released the following day. He spent 2 weeks in detention, in federal detention, as part of this whole deal. And so so it's like, let's try that meeting again. So the FBI goes back to the Spanish National Police to review what was going on here, and they bring in on the night of May 23, and following the meeting with the SNP, they bring in this guy. This is Steve Meager, and Steve Meager is a fairly notable guy in the history of latent prints at this time. So he was the primary advocate in court for the zero error rate claim. And so, as for example, in a Daubert hearing, which is a hearing that criminal courts have, and I believe civil courts, to examine whether evidence is valid or not. So in a Daubert review of latent prints, Steve Meagher in 2002 said, the methodology has an error rate of 0, where practitioner error rate is whatever practitioner error rates for that individual or group of individuals would be. So the idea is here, he's saying that the humans can make an error, but the procedure is infallible. And there's several problems with this. Most importantly is that ACE-V, the analysis, comparison, evaluation, and verification process, is a set of rules and steps for a human examiner to follow. And so the human examiner, it isn't like you have some kind of like you're mixing chemical. And so sodium and chlorine always make salt, right? It isn't like that. It's a set of procedures. It's a recipe that humans follow to do fingerprint analysis. So you can't divide the two. And secondly, you can't test the protocol without using humans. And so to say the methodology has a 0 error rate is unscientific because it's unfalsifiable. There's no empirical test you can design to determine whether the methodology has a 0 error rate or not. And finally, we don't have enough statistical research data to be able to determine whether you could do a model showing that ACE-V could be at that low error rate. And we actually do now have, later on, there was some research in this area showing that there is an error rate, but it is quite small. Fingerprint examination is generally very, very reliable. So this was an outlier case in many ways. Nonetheless, on the night of the 23rd and 24th of May in 2004, Meagher looked at LFP 17 and source number 4 and the dude print, and concluded quite clearly that source number 4, Brandon Mayfield, was not a match to LFP 17. So, again, Meagher was not a dishonest man. He was just an ardent advocate for the discipline of latent print examination. But in this case, he was I don't know, something of a hero of the story. I don't know if you want to call it that, but he was the person who came back and told the FBI clearly that they had indeed made a mistake and that the SNP was correct. And of course, more headlines follow at this point. And, the terror case collapses and of course, the inevitable civil lawsuit against the FBI. Again, I've worked with the FBI on projects and things of that nature. I know many folks from the FBI. The one thing I am impressed with about this case more than any other is not the lawsuit itself or the fact that he got $2 million settlement from the Department of Justice for his wrongful detainment in this case. But more than that, he insisted on and got an apology, right? I don't know if the FBI apologized a lot, but they did apologize to Mayfield, and justifiably so. There was an error made. The FBI did get ahead of themselves here and made a clear error in the case. This is one of the things that was said from the quality assurance review that I think is worth talking to. The apparent mindset of the initial examiner after reviewing the results of the search was that a match did exist. That is that like I said, big database. They thought they were going to get somebody. It would be reasonable to assume that the other characteristics must match if there was a match to the original 7. It's a short, in the absence of a detailed analysis of the print, right? In other words, they rush under pressure. It can be a short distance from finding only 7 characteristics sufficient for plotting. By that, they mean that you plot out the constellation of the prints of the points in the latent print that you think you can find, and you use that to input into the IAFASYST plot prior to the automated search to the position of 12 or 13 matching characteristics once the mindset of identification has become dominant. This would not be an intentional misinterpretation of the data, but it would be an incorrect interpretation nonetheless. They were convinced that somebody was going to be in that top 20 that was the contributor of that print, And by God, they found somebody. And it turned out to be Brandon Mayfield. The other thing that was going on here internally at the FBI, I also think is worth talking. And so after 9/11, the FBI under Robert Mueller had really changed its management philosophy and mission to a very large degree. Prior to this time, the FBI was very much of a backstop for state and local law enforcement for difficult cases, especially for cases that were more within its jurisdiction, such as interstate and bank robberies and things of that nature. After 9/11, Mueller moved the FBI very strongly toward a counterterrorism mission. There was a feeling that FBI needed to be on top of that as a major need for the nation at that time. But they really had not completed the transition. They were still doing a lot of their traditional criminal case work and things like, and some national security work, but they were also doing the terrorism work as well, including things that were coming out of the war zones in Afghanistan and Iraq as well. And so there was a lot of pressure just already chronic on these examiners when LFP 17 dropped on their desk in March of 2004. At this point, examiners were getting 54 on average. On average, they were getting 54 cases per examiner per month. And that is just an extraordinary caseload, a very difficult caseload for them to manage. Afterward, there was a limit put on of 40 cases per examiner per month to help with that, to improve kind of this ongoing stress problem that the examiners were under, and which made them vulnerable to this rushing under judgment and lack of consistent standards when a critical incident created this this problem, this mistake in the Mayfield case. Now, again, I want to clarify this issue about his background. So this is what the Office of Inspector General said in that 2006 report after the fact, and when they went through it and if you really are into this, it's several hundred pages. It's a great read. It's really for an Office of Inspector General report. It's a very good read. Mayfield's background did contribute to the failure to sufficiently reconsider the identification after legitimate questions about it were raised. In other words, didn't create the impression of the original match, but it did make people say, well, I think we got our guy. I mean, Wieners, who was one of the internal FBI people at this point, candidly admitted that if the person identified had been someone without these circumstances, like the Maytag repairman, the laboratory might have revisited the identification with more skepticism and caught the error. So again, not the original, but certainly afterward, there was this bias that caused a problem in terms of and how the FBI handled the case. There was a kind of a tunnel vision that was established. Part of it was just the arrogance of the FBI. Part of it was the this idea that they were under pressure because of the sheer visibility of the case and of the bombing and of the Iraq War. And part of it became eventually who Mayfield was and what his background was, and this idea that they had to have gotten it right. And in the end, and that tunnel vision really undermined their effectiveness and reliability. The primary lesson, the one that's more generalizable, though, at least I hope it's more generalizable in terms of like something that we can all see can happen in almost any circle, is this idea of maintaining standards when you're under pressure. It can create not just tunnel vision, but this willingness to abandon your stand. And this is really, I think, that to me, the primary takeaway. One of the things that was speculated after the fact was, well, should we have, for example, blind verification? Should the people, and this is a classic case where it could have helped, right? Because even the independent examiner was biased by the mistake that the first examiner had made in identifying Mayfield in source number 4. And the one of the things that came out of that was this idea that, well, we don't have the resources, which I can understand, to have a blind verification in every case. That takes more effort, takes more money, and more resources to do that in every case. And so they said, well, we'll do that in high priority case. And there's a couple of problems with that. First, a lot of wrongful convictions were defendants who just, they weren't a priority, so they got forgotten, and mistakes were made, and many of them will probably never be discovered. So whose priority is it in terms of what's high priority, low priority. The other is that you can't get into the mindset of changing your standards when you're under pressure. The high priority case, if it's going to be handled correct, has got to be handled in a manner that's similar to the rest of your work. If you all of a sudden change standards when you're under pressure, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to make mistakes when it's most crucial, really, is what the argument is here. And that is when it's most important for you to be reliable, when it's most important for you to to finger the right person, that's when you'll make a mistake if you abandon your standards at that point. And that's a lesson not just for fingerprint examination, but for any forensic expert, but actually any expert whatsoever. If you're an expert and you're under pressure, make sure you maintain your standards. A very, very key lesson, Madrid bombing. I hope you've enjoyed this. I really enjoyed sharing it with you. It's an important case, a really fascinating one. And I encourage you, if you have an interest, I put a couple of references in the descriptor box so that you can kind of look at this in more detail if you have an interest. There's a lot to be learned from the Brandon Mayfield case. And I'm glad thank you for spending the time with me today.